There was a night in the New Hampshire woods when the wind didn't blow, the trees didn't sway, and every sound felt swallowed by something waiting. A little girl rides through the dark forest, eyes wide, not with fear, but with the weight of something the world has tried to forget. In a moss-covered stone circle, she lays down a charred comb and whispers, "I hear you." In that moment, the horse lets out a long, trembling cry, the trees shudder, and what rises from the earth isn't a body, but the truth. A truth buried for 60 years. The story of a woman who dared to ride like a man and was silenced because of it. If you've ever heard a whinny in the wind, if you believe the past doesn't die, it waits to be told. Subscribe now to join us for the next chapters where memory returns and silence is broken. It soars above an endless sprawl of golden trees, dipping low through the rustle of New Hampshire's autumn canopy. Crimson, amber, and ochre blur beneath the drone's slow descent, each leaf trembling like a whisper from something forgotten. The wind murmurs. The forest is alive, watching. A sharp whinny cuts through the silence. Not near, not far, like it echoes from the marrow of the woods. The drone drifts lower. In a forest clearing carved into the hillside, a tent flaps lazily in the morning breeze. A family of 4 stirs around a crackling fire, mugs of cocoa, tired yawns. A father flipping pancakes on a battered skillet. But this is not their story. This is hers. Hannah Carson, 9 years old, sits perched on a mossy log just beyond the circle of campfire warmth. She's bundled in a seafoam jacket 2 sizes too big, hands stuffed in the sleeves, staring off into the fog between birches. She's not drawing, not reading, just watching. The kind of child who doesn't speak unless the words are ready. The kind of child the forest remembers. Her boots are still wet from the stream they crossed earlier. Twigs cling to her ponytail. There's dirt under her nails. But her gaze sharp. A private little blade. She blinks slowly like something old inside her is thinking. Across the clearing, a horse chews calmly in its tether. Chestnut coat, eyes like wet stones. Her name is Maple, and she is magnificent. Maple's mane flows thick and tangled, untamed, like rain woven with smoke. Hannah loves her the way she never could explain at school, where girls with pastel backpacks say horses are just a phase. But Maple is not a phase. Maple is her silence and her secret and her sanctuary. Hannah rises without a word. Her parents don't notice Dad's burning the pancakes, Mom's yelling not again, and her little brother is poking sticks into the fire like a goblin. She walks into the edge of trees, where the mist huddles low to the ground, like breath on glass. She isn't running away. She just doesn't want to be near people today. The woods are still wet from last night's rain. Every footstep is a hush. Birds stir overhead. Something drops from a branch. Hannah steps into a small grove, where the air seems thicker, more expectant. A half-buried tree stump juts up from the earth like a severed limb. And there, nestled into the moss at its base, something catches her eye. Wood, but not fallen. A comb. She kneels slowly. It's small, no bigger than her palm, smoothed by age and weather. The wood is dark, nearly black in the center, with teeth that taper like worn bone. She turns it over. Lillian. The name is carved with loving precision on the back, now faded but clear. No last name, no date, just Lillian. She runs her thumb across the letters. The L curls like a vine. Whoever made this made it carefully. Then she looks up. Maple. Her mare stands between 2 trees, ears flicked forward, eyes locked on Hannah. She hadn't even heard her approach. Her breath ghosts out in the cold. And Hannah, without thinking, steps forward. Later, she will not remember why she did it. Why she didn't ask questions. Why she didn't go back to show her mom or tuck it into her backpack. Some part of her, older than memory, older than herself, just moves. She pulls the comb through Maple's mane, once, gently. The instant the wood touches hair, the forest recoils. Maple screams. It's not a neigh, not a grunt. It's a tearing sound, an alarm bell, wild and raw and primal. She rears. Hannah stumbles back as hooves churn the earth beside her. Maple's eyes roll white. Her chest heaves like thunder beneath a velvet coat. Her tether snaps not cleanly, but like the leather gave up. Then she bolts into the forest, headlong, as if something just awoke behind her, and she has no time to explain. For a full 5 seconds, Hannah doesn't move. Her legs are jelly. Her ears ring. In her hand, the comb still burns with cold. Then her heart kicks into her throat. Maple, she gasps. And just like that, she's running. Not yelling for help, not crying, just running fast and hard into the trees where Maple vanished. This part of the forest is different. No markers. No worn paths. It tightens around her like it doesn't want her to pass. Branches claw at her coat. Brambles bite her calves. She leaps over fallen logs, ducks under limbs, guided only by hoofprints and instinct. The deeper she goes, the more the world narrows. The trees grow older here, gnarled like knuckles. The air smells like iron and cedar. Light barely filters through. She's gasping now. Her lungs burn. Her voice finally cracks, Maple. Please, she stumbles. Her knees hit mud. She rises again. Then just beyond the next ridge, she hears it. Breathing. Not the panting of a wild gallop. Slower. Deeper. She creeps forward, wiping her nose on her sleeve until she crests the hill and stops dead. Below her is a shallow glade ringed in stones. Perfect circle. Each stone moss-covered and standing like an altar. And in the center, Maple, still as a statue. Her head lowered not in exhaustion, but reverence. Her body trembles. Her ears twitch. But she doesn't move. Hannah steps down one slow foot at a time into the glade. The air here is wrong. No birds, no breeze. Just the sound of her breath and something else beneath it. A hum, low and mournful, like cello strings buried in the dirt. She walks toward Maple. Then she sees the stone. It stands apart from the rest. Taller, rougher. At first she thinks it's just the light, but as she nears, she sees the markings. Scratched into the face of the stone barely visible beneath lichen and time are words, "Return it to me." She stares, not etched neatly, scratched, like fingernails or desperate hands. Her hand grips the comb. Maple doesn't move. Her knees give a little, and she drops to the ground beside the mare. Presses her forehead against Maple's flank. The horse shudders, but doesn't flinch. Her breath comes slower now, deeper almost, matching Hannah's. They sit there like that, child and horse, bound by something unspoken. When her parents find her, 15 minutes later, frantic, breathless, she doesn't respond to their shouting at first. She's still staring at the stone, still clutching the comb. Her mother calls her name. Her father grabs her shoulders. She finally looks up. "She brought me here," she says. Not crying, not scared, just certain. They try to understand. They fail. Her brother points at the stone and says, "That's not writing. That's just scratches." But Hannah doesn't answer. Her eyes remain fixed. Because for the briefest moment just before the wind picked up, she swore she saw it. The faint impression of a woman's hand on the moss. Still reaching. Still waiting. They came crashing through the trees like a wave of panic. Leaves scattered in their wake. Boots sank into soft soil. A voice sharp with fear cut through the hush of the forest. Hannah, the little brother, got there first. Only because he didn't care about thorns or branches. He was crying now, the kind of snotty wail that didn't ask for help, it demanded it. Then the mother's shoulder bloodied from a fall. Then the father torn jeans, eyes darting like a hunted animal. But the clearing didn't care about their panic. The forest had already made a decision. They stopped at the edge of the glade, breath caught like knives in their throats. Hannah was standing inside the circle, not moving, not turning. Her body slack but upright, like something forgotten holding its own shape. And Maple, kneeling, a full-grown mare, chestnut and proud, lowered on folded legs like a statue before an altar. Her mane curled around her face like a mourning veil. Her eyes weren't panicked, they were wet, almost human. No one spoke. The boy's cry turned into a hiccup and died. The clearing didn't want sound. It wanted stillness. Then the mother stepped forward. "Honey." She choked halfway through the word, because now she saw it. The stone just beyond her daughter's shoulder. Old and lichen blind, but still marked. "Return it to me." 4 words, scratched, uneven, desperate. The kind of message that wasn't carved for the living. The wind picked up again, cold and sudden. It ruffled Hannah's hair. She didn't flinch. Her face was tilted slightly upward, lips parted, pupils dilated. Not like someone daydreaming, like someone listening. "Baby," the father said softly, inching forward. "You okay?" No response. Just one more breath, one more blink. Then Hannah's knees gave out. She didn't fall hard, more like folded. Her body slumped into Maple's side, and the horse shifted just enough to catch her. Only then did the forest release its hold. Maple exhaled, a long shuddering sigh. The wind stopped. Birds unseen above the canopy began chirping again. Life resumed clumsily, awkwardly, like an audience after a scene they didn't understand. Back at the campsite, no one spoke during the walk back. The mother held Hannah like something made of eggshell. The father led Maple with a rope and a white-knuckled grip. The brother dragged his feet, eyes wide, as if worried the trees might remember him. It wasn't until the tent was zipped, the fire restoked, and dinner long forgotten that anyone tried again. "Honey," the mother said, "what happened?" Hannah sat cross-legged on a sleeping pad, still wearing her muddy coat. Her hair was full of burrs. Her hands were smudged with dirt. She looked up. "I didn't do it." "Didn't do what?" "She made me go." "Who?" "The lady." They didn't get much else. Not that night. Not with that tone. She wasn't scared. She wasn't confused. She was separate. like something had shifted and hadn't snapped back yet. At midnight, her mother awoke to find the girl sitting bolt upright, breathing hard, staring into the dark, with eyes that didn't blink. She didn't remember it in the morning, but what came next was worse. By breakfast, she had found her sketchbook. It was still damp from the mist. Pages warped, edges curled. She opened it like a priest might open a relic. Reverent, careful. Then she began to draw. And draw. And draw. No cartoon horses or princesses, no doodles of flowers or suns with smiley faces. Instead, a woman, always the same woman. Hair long and unbound. Lips tight. Body pitched forward as if she rode hard. Legs clutched around a racing steed. And fire. Always behind her. A field of flames eating the horizon. Sometimes she looked forward. Sometimes she looked over her shoulder. But the feeling never changed. Fleeing something, or becoming it. What struck them first was the detail. The lines were wrong. Too smooth, too fast. The kind of strokes someone made with their dominant hand. Only, Hannah was right-handed. She was drawing with her left. The mother said nothing at first. She was too busy trying not to let the child see her hands shake. She flipped through the pages, each more precise than the last. The woman was evolving. More wrinkles in the coat. More definition in the horse's muscles. More wind in the hair. Like the girl wasn't just drawing her. She was remembering her. By evening, June arrived. Not for the first time. She was the kind of grandmother who brought peppermint lozenges and garden scissors. Who wore sweaters that always smelled faintly of rosemary. Her bones hurt in the fall, but she never said no to a call. Especially not when her daughter's voice cracked on the phone. She sat beside Hannah without speaking. Watched the child draw for almost 15 minutes. Then she asked, "May I see?" Hannah nodded. June turned the page and froze. Time didn't stop, but it slowed. The air went syrupy. The trees outside leaned closer. She held the image like it might splinter. A woman on horseback, wind in her face, grief in her mouth. "Oh my God," June whispered. Her daughter leaned in. "You okay?" But June wasn't listening. She turned the page. Another sketch. This time the woman's hair curled in the wind like a noose. And the next, eyes narrowed, face shadowed hand, gripping the reins as if they were the only thing keeping her anchored to the world. June's voice was very small. "It's her." "Who?" "My sister." She stood and crossed the room in 5 fast steps, pulled open her canvas bag, reached into the depths of a folded plastic envelope yellowed with time. Inside photographs, black and white. Faded but not forgotten. She laid them out on the floor like tarot cards. Hannah stopped drawing, because there she was. Lillian. The resemblance wasn't just uncanny, it was exact. Same jawline, same high cheekbones, same stubborn tilt of the mouth, same wild hair like it never agreed to be brushed. Lillian Carson, gone since 1965. Last seen riding her horse west through the edge of the county near the old river basin. No witnesses, no goodbye note, just vanished. Her horse Violet was never found either. They said she ran off with a man June said eyes wet but fierce. Some cowboy. Or a preacher's son. They had all kinds of stories. "Did she?" the daughter asked. "No," June said flatly. "How do you know?" "Because she was the one who stayed with me when I had that fever. Because she made me birthday cakes from scratch when Mama forgot. Because she loved that horse like it was a part of her rib cage. Maybe she changed." "She didn't change. The world did." Hannah was quiet the whole time. Eyes darting between sketchbook and photos. Lips pressed into a line. "Where did she go?" the boy finally asked. No one answered, until Hannah looked up. "She's waiting." For what her mother asked. Hannah turned to June. To be believed. That night, June tucked her into bed. The child's voice was calm but distant, like radio static in a storm. "She didn't run." "I know," June said. "She was pushed." "I know, baby." She said she couldn't scream loud enough. June's hands trembled. She looked down at her own palms. Old, wrinkled, useless. Then she looked at the child. And for the first time in decades, she remembered the sound of hooves on dirt, and the way they echoed too long. It rained that night. Not hard, not loud. Just a thin, steady tapping against the canvas roof of the tent, like someone whispering with their fingers. The kind of rain that feels like it's trying to remember something. Inside the camp was quiet. The children asleep. The parents restless. The fire outside hissed into steam. And June sat cross-legged beneath the glow of a lantern, staring into the corner like it owed her answers. She held the old photograph in her lap. The one with Lillian atop Violet the horse with the storm-black eyes. Lillian wasn't smiling in the picture. She never did. But her chin was raised, her spine straight. Defiant, even in stillness. That was her gift, and her curse. "Tell me," her daughter said, settling beside her with 2 mugs of coffee neither of them would finish. June didn't move at first. Then her voice came low, gritty, not for effect, but because the words had to claw their way out. "She was the best rider I ever saw." The daughter nodded. "I remember Mama said that." "No, she didn't." Mama said she was reckless. Said she had a man's hunger for land. You know what that meant, right? Her daughter blinked. I thought she meant Lillian liked to explore. June laughed. Sharp, bitter. She meant Lillian wanted freedom, the kind women weren't supposed to want. Back then, being born a girl meant fences, and she tried to jump everyone. She turned the photo, tapped her fingernail against the corner. That's the old riding hill, west of town, the last place she was seen. They found her hat there, half burned, like it had been struck by lightning. You said no one ever found her body. No, no blood, no trail, no sign of the horse. Just that scorched hat and a smell in the air. What smell? Like ash and rain and iron. They were both quiet for a moment. Then the mother asked it, the question that had been rising in her chest since they left the stone circle. The comb. What the hell is it, Mom? June looked up. Grief. Her daughter shook her head. No, I mean physically. What is it? Where did it come from? June didn't blink. I told you. Grief. Doesn't matter how it was made. It only matters who touched it and what they left behind. In the corner of the tent, Hannah stirred. Not a dreamer's stir, not the lazy roll of sleep. A shiver. A jolt. She sat up suddenly, eyes wide, but not awake. Her lips moved. No sound. Her mother crossed the tent in 2 quick strides. Honey, you okay? But Hannah wasn't there. Not really. Her mouth opened again. This time something came out. Not a scream, a whisper. I didn't leave. The voice didn't sound like her. Too low, too steady, too grown. June was already fumbling for her phone. Not to call anyone. To record. The voice came again. They didn't believe me. They said I was just mad. Just spoiled. Just a girl. Hannah's mother pressed her hands to the child's cheeks. Wake up, baby. Please. But Hannah didn't blink. Didn't flinch. Her pupils weren't even tracking the light. They locked the stable. Said it wasn't ladylike. Said I'd break my neck like a fool. But she waited for me. Violet always waited. Tears streamed down the girl's cheeks. And then the voice cracked, not with fear, with rage. He broke it. He took the comb. Snapped it in front of me like a goddamn priest snapping sin. Said it was the devil's mirror. Then silence. Hannah blinked. She looked up at her mother like she'd just come to. Then promptly vomited into her lap. She didn't remember it the next morning, but June played the recording back 5 times before sunrise. Later that day, they sat together on the picnic table beside the fire pit, the comb lying between them, like a grenade with no pin. June didn't touch it. I remember when she got it, she said, Got what? The comb. Lillian. She'd saved up her birthday money for 3 months, walked to town alone, said she wanted something that was hers, just hers. She took a breath. It had a gold inlay once, long gone now, but it was beautiful. She called it her mane tamer. She'd sit on the porch and brush Violet for hours, said it helped them think as one. The daughter leaned back. Why didn't you tell me all this before? June looked at her. Because you wouldn't have believed me. Try me. June laughed again. You're a mother. Your first instinct is to protect, not to understand. And this isn't safe, is it? The daughter looked down at her coffee. It was cold. No, she whispered. It's not. Inside the tent, Hannah was drawing again. The woman this time was alone. No horse? Just her on a cliff wind, peeling her dress into ribbons, hair tangled like vines, hands clenched at her sides. The fire behind her had grown larger, and the sky above was split with lightning. At dinner, the boy asked what spoiled meant. Nobody answered. That night, they moved Hannah's sleeping pad between the parents. They didn't talk about why. They didn't have to. Just after 2 a.m., she sat up again. June was already awake, sitting by the fire outside listening through the mesh. The whisper came first. No one came for me. June's heart dropped. Then louder. I waited at the circle. For hours, days, years. I don't know anymore. The recording caught it all. Every broken sentence, every plea, every ache. Then clear as a church bell. I didn't run. I rode. June stood in the dark. The forest beyond the tent flinched. She picked up the comb from where it lay beside her chair and held it in both hands. The wood pulsed with cold. She didn't care. At dawn, Hannah slept soundly for the first time in 3 nights. The birds returned to the clearing. The sun was pale but brave. And the comb, it lay on the table, still. But for just a second, when the breeze lifted the corner of Hannah's sketchbook, you could swear you heard hooves. Morning slammed into the campsite like a fist. The air was brittle with tension. No one mentioned breakfast. The fire remained unlit. Even the trees around them seemed to brace. The father paced, his fingers curled and uncurled. His boots kicked up pine needles with every turn. He glanced at the folding table, at the thing sitting atop it, and flinched again. The comb, unmoving, harmless. And yet, it's not staying, he said. His wife, arms crossed, jaw tight, stood just outside the tent flap. We're not burning it. It's a piece of wood. No, it isn't. He spun to face her. That thing made our daughter talk in tongues. She's 9, for God's sake. June stepped between them. She wasn't possessed. Oh, right. Then what would you call it? She was remembering. Whose memory? Silence. That was the wound. Neither of them could bandage the knowing that what came out of Hannah's mouth did not belong to her. The father pointed at the comb. We don't know what that thing is. We don't know where it's been. And it doesn't belong here. June narrowed her eyes. Maybe it never did. He blinked. What? She looked past him into the trees. Maybe it was never meant to stay hidden. Maybe we were supposed to find it. We, he scoffed. You mean her. You mean Hannah. My daughter. She's my granddaughter. Exactly. And you're feeding her ghost stories. She's not the one who's scared. That landed. Hard. He stepped back, shook his head. You want to see scared? His voice cracked, then surged. Try watching your little girl sit up in the dark and whisper with a voice that's not hers. Try explaining that to her pediatrician, to a priest, to the cops. Hell, try explaining it to yourself. No one answered. In the silence, Hannah stepped out of the tent, barefoot, pale, silent. She didn't flinch at the cold. She didn't ask about the fight. She just walked to the comb, picked it up, and held it to her chest. Then she sat cross-legged on the ground and began to hum, not a song, a rhythm, like hoofbeats. Jacob heard it before he saw them. The old man was splitting firewood behind his cabin, a moss-covered square of timber deep inside the southern woods. He looked up. Crows stirred. The trees leaned. Visitors were rare. These visitors impossible. June came first, leading Hannah by the hand. Her eyes were set, her mouth a line. Jacob hadn't seen her in 20 years, but some people don't change where it counts. He set down the axe, wiped his hands, waited. You look like hell, he said. June smiled thinly. And you look like a pine cone stuffed into a jacket. He laughed, a real one. Then his eyes fell to the girl, and then to the thing in her hands. He stopped laughing. They sat on the porch steps. The forest hummed around them, as if straining to hear. Jacob watched Hannah for a long time. She's got it, he said finally. June nodded. She found it, she added. That's so. He looked at the child. Did it call to you, sweetheart? Hannah didn't answer. She just held the comb a little tighter. Jacob looked at June. You tell her yet? Tell me what? Jacob leaned back, bones creaking. About me and Lillian. June went still. The words came slow. Not out of hesitation, but a reverence. Like they'd waited too long to be spoken. She came here a lot back in the day, Jacob said. Before it all went to hell. He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. She'd sneak out after church. Ride Violet like the devil's at her heels. Show up with her cheeks on fire and her hair full of wind. Said I was the only one who didn't treat her like a sermon. Were you in love with her? June asked. Jacob looked down. I was in awe. He led them behind the cabin, through a narrow trail overrun with vines, past rotted fence posts and the bones of old barrels. Finally to a clearing that barely breathed anymore, and there it stood. The old stable, leaning, hollow-eyed. Roof partially collapsed, but the shape still held a ghost of boards and beams and memories. This is where she rode, he said. June blinked, but the town said, they said she was dangerous. Wild. Rebellious. He turned a voice sharp. They said women shouldn't sit astride, that it would break their wombs. He snorted. Idiots. June touched the stable door. It creaked beneath her palm. Jacob's voice softened. She rode like a warrior, like she wasn't asking permission. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and dust and something deeper. Not rot, something like sorrow. Hannah stepped into the center of the room. The beams above creaked softly like a memory stretching in its sleep. She turned slowly. Her eyes scanned the walls, then stopped. A beam near the corner scratched worn, almost invisible beneath time. But she saw it. Lillian, carved into the wood. Below it another word. Strong. She did that, Jacob whispered. After her father told her she'd never be as strong as a man. Said horses only obeyed men. He chuckled once. She rode Violet harder the next day than I'd ever seen. Made that mare dance in circles. Not with reins, not with spurs, just with will. He paused. Lillian never broke horses. She talked to them. Hannah walked to the beam, reached out, touched the name. The comb slipped from her fingers. Hit the floor, bounced once, then settled. Face up. Jacob's eyes went wide. It's warm, he whispered. God almighty. June stepped forward. You said she didn't run. Jacob nodded. She told me the night before she vanished. Said she'd had enough. Said she wanted to ride out to the ridge and scream until the trees gave her name back. He looked away. I begged her not to go. Said the town wouldn't understand. Said her father would stop her. He swallowed. I never saw her again. Outside thunder rolled. Not close, but real. Jacob looked at Hannah. She's carrying it, you know. What June asked. Lillian's voice. It chose her. Hannah didn't blink. I can feel her, she whispered. Jacob nodded. She didn't disappear. She was erased. June looked at him. He looked back. They didn't just want her gone, he said. They wanted her forgotten. The stable groaned. Dust drifted from the rafters. And somewhere deep in the earth, beneath their feet, something remembered. It started with fire. In her dream, the sky was already burning. Not a gentle orange flicker, but an unholy red thick with smoke. It moved like an animal circling the field, pressing in closer with every breath. And in the center of it all, there she was. Lillian. Hannah didn't know how she knew the woman's name or why it felt so familiar. She just did, as if the name lived inside her bones. The woman was on horseback, her hands trembling against the reins, her face smeared with ash. Her mouth didn't move, but her eyes screamed. And behind her, through the crimson haze, figures moved. Men, shadows, uniforms. No too old, too stiff. Then the sound came, the kind of sound that didn't belong in dreams. A rip, a roar, hooves hammering the earth, and a voice low hoarse torn from a throat that hadn't screamed in 60 years. Let me go. Hannah shot up in her sleeping bag, breath of ragged sweat gluing her shirt to her spine. The lantern her mother had left on the hook above the tent glowed low, barely illuminating the outlines of her family asleep beside her. She turned to her right. Maple, the mare, stood just outside the mesh flap, tethered, her breath fogging in the cold. But her eyes... God, her eyes were wide, too wide, like she'd seen it too, as if the dream didn't belong to Hannah alone. The next morning, she didn't speak. She barely touched her cereal. Left her boots untied, didn't respond when her brother pestered her with questions. She walked to Maple with quiet steps and pressed her forehead to the horse's shoulder. Maple didn't flinch. Instead, the mare closed her eyes. They breathed as one. By the third night, the dreams had a pattern. Always the fire, always the woman, always the scream. But now, more. A barn, a scream, a struggle. Lillian no longer on horseback, being dragged from the stable by a man with fists for hands. His face blurred, swallowed by the dream's edges. But Hannah felt his hate. Thick, black, like oil. His voice boomed as he pulled her to her knees. You are not a son. Another scream. Then the snip, the sound of metal shears slicing through air. Hannah watched, trapped behind the woman's eyes, as her hair fell in clumps to the ground. Long, beautiful strands. Gone. The man tossed them into the fire. The flames hissed, and then he held something up. The comb. He snapped it in two and hurled it into the woods. Lillian collapsed, but she didn't cry. She just whispered, "You'll forget me." Hannah woke with blood on her hands. She didn't remember cutting herself. There was no wound, just red streaks across her palms. Sticky. Real. Her mother panicked. Her father cursed. June watched her in silence, jaw clenched so tight the muscle jumped in her cheek. She didn't speak until later. When I was little, June said, sitting beside Hannah by the creek. I used to hear her crying. Hannah looked up. In the trees, June added. In the stables. In my dreams. Lillian. She never left. That afternoon, Hannah did something she hadn't done in weeks. She asked to ride. They hesitated, of course. Maple had been unpredictable ever since the circle. Jumpy. Distant. Her gait tight, like she was fighting something with every stride. But when Hannah approached with the comb tucked in her pocket, Maple lowered her head. Not submissive. Willing. The moment Hannah climbed into the saddle, something shifted. Her posture changed. Her back straightened. Her grip tightened. She leaned forward, whispering something only the horse could hear. And then they moved. Not trotted. Not galloped. Glided. From the campsite, June watched with a hand over her mouth. Her daughter stood frozen beside her. Look at her hands, June whispered. What? She's holding the reins like Lillian used to. What are you saying? I'm saying that's not just Hannah. Maple thundered across the clearing hooves, brushing leaves without sound, like the earth had agreed to hold its breath. Hannah didn't guide her. She didn't need to. Her hands barely moved yet. The mare responded to every shift in her weight, every breath. It was riding, yes, but it was also more than riding. It was memory waking through muscle. It was a ghost in motion. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she was in two places at once. Now on Maple's back through golden October trees. And then on Violet and black and white, the air full of heat and ash, and something burning she couldn't name. The wind in her ears wasn't wind. It was voices, snatches of argument, accusations, someone pleading. It's not right. Not a proper girl. People will talk. She'll shame the family. Each word struck her spine like a lash. She gritted her teeth. She was Hannah, but she wasn't. Her hands felt older, stronger. And somewhere deep in her ribs, something was screaming to be remembered. When she returned to camp, the silence hit like a slap. Her parents watched her descend from Maple's back like they were seeing a stranger. Her mother stepped forward. Sweetie, are you okay? Hannah blinked, but her answer didn't come in words. She raised one hand, slow, deliberate, and mimicked brushing long hair over her shoulder. Only her hair was in a braid, and her face, wet, though she hadn't cried. That night, the dreams didn't wait for sleep. She sat by the fire sketchpad in her lap, the comb pressed between her knees. And then it started again. Her hand moved on its own. Long flowing lines. A woman crouched behind a wall of hay bales. Smoke in the background. A man pacing in the distance. Another stroke. The woman running. Another. Her reaching for the horse's mane. Wild and desperate. The drawing looked nothing like the others. This one had blood. On the hands. On the saddle. On the locket she wore around her neck. And on the ground, trailing behind the horse. Like ribbons her hair. She's trying to get out. June whispered from across the fire. Her daughter flinched. What do you mean? Lillian? She's not resting. She's returning. Later, while Hannah finally drifted to sleep beside Maple's stall, June pulled out the oldest photo she had of her sister. She stared at it for a long time. And then, with hands that shook harder than they should have, she pulled out a box of tea candles, a lighter, and the sketch Hannah had drawn. The one with the locket. She had seen it before. She knew where it was. The woods were colder that morning. The frost clung longer. The sun felt hesitant. Even the birds sounded muted, as if they too had heard the dreams. June rose before anyone else. She packed slowly, deliberately. A mason jar of white tea candles. A box of matches. The sketch Hannah had drawn. The comb. And finally, from the bottom of her bag, a necklace. Silver chain, heart-shaped locket. Inside, a black and white photo of two girls laughing mid-blur, arms around each other. One of them was her, the other Lillian. The chain had broken years ago. Their father had hidden it, but June found it again last winter in an old shoebox marked, "Do Not Touch." That night she dreamed of hooves. Now she knew why. She didn't wake Hannah. Didn't ask permission. She just walked into the forest, heart pounding like a warning bell, until she found the circle. The moss was damp beneath her boots. The stones loomed older than memory. The air thickened with every step. This wasn't just forest anymore. It was altar. She knelt in the center, laid the sketchbook flat, the drawing of Lillian on top, placed the comb beside it, then gently, reverently, the locket. She arranged the candles in a circle, fingers trembling with every match strike. When the last flame lit, the wind stopped. Not calmed. Stopped. Not a single leaf moved. Even the birds went silent. The flames didn't flicker. They stood tall and straight, as if saluting something unseen. June whispered, "Not a prayer. Not quite. I'm sorry." She didn't know who she was saying it to, her sister, her granddaughter herself. "I didn't speak when I should have. I didn't shout. I didn't stand between you and him." The tears came without ceremony. I was small, but I knew what he did. And I stayed quiet. She reached out and touched the comb. It was warm, almost pulsing. "Come back, Lil. If you can hear me, come back." Then the sky cracked. Not thunder. A sound deeper, older, like stone tearing from stone. Rain poured from a cloudless sky. Back at camp, Hannah jolted upright. Maple reared hooves scraping the stall wall, and every candle in the circle blew out in unison. June stood there, soaked, the sketchbook pressed to her chest. The locket was gone. So was the comb. When she returned drenched and speechless, Hannah walked straight to her. Didn't ask where she'd gone. Just looked up into her eyes and whispered, "She heard you." That evening, the air smelled different. The tension that had gripped the woods for days lifted. Birdsong returned. Maple grazed in peace, her eyes soft, no longer glassy with unseen memories. Hannah played with her brother, laughing for the first time since the dreams began. But when she passed by the fire pit, something shimmered in the corner of her eye. A silver glint, half buried in the ashes. She knelt, dug with careful fingers, and there, resting like an artifact, returned from another world. The comb, not burned, not broken, but whole and warm. When she picked it up, a breeze whispered through the trees. Not words, just the distant sound of hooves, and the memory of a woman's hair flying wild through firelight. Jacob didn't speak for a long time. The fire crackled between them, casting jagged shadows on his weather-worn face. His hands, strong, once steady, now trembled against the chipped rim of his coffee mug. In the deepening dusk, his voice came not as a story, but a confession dragged out from marrow. "I saw him do it." June didn't move, didn't blink, just waited. Jacob's throat clenched. "I saw Harold Carson drag her out of the stall." Lillian, she was 16, maybe 17, already taller than him, stronger in spirit if not in muscle. He glanced toward the trees like they might interrupt. She'd been riding again, practicing jumps. There was a show in Dover she wanted to enter. Women weren't allowed to compete, but she didn't give a damn. She said she'd show up anyway, make them watch her ride. He paused. "She had that fire, June. You remember?" But Harold, he didn't care about fire. He only cared about obedience. The air turned colder around the fire. Even Maple, tethered at the edge of camp, shifted uneasily. Jacob set the mug down. "I was in the hayloft. I'd gone there to leave her a note. Just a stupid scrap of paper folded twice, telling her I'd gotten the permit forms she asked for. Thought I'd surprise her." He exhaled. The sound was full of guilt. Then he came in. June didn't push. She didn't have to. Jacob's eyes were already far away. He was drunk. I could smell it from where I sat. Called her a filthy boy in a girl's dress. Said she'd embarrassed the family. That no daughter of his would straddle a saddle like some barmaid. A pause. Then he hit her. Hannah sat still curled at June's side. She didn't ask how hard. The bruises had always been invisible in the pictures. Jacob's voice turned jagged. She didn't cry. Didn't scream. Just stood there, blood on her lip, and said, "Then I'll stop being your daughter." He laughed once, hollow. God. That broke him more than any blade could have. He grabbed the comb from her hand. She always carried it even while riding, and snapped it in two. Then he grabbed her by the braid. God help me, June, he cut her hair right there in the stall and threw it in the dirt. He covered his eyes. She didn't move. Not even then. Just picked up the broken pieces, walked to Violet, and left. She never came back. Silence stretched like winter between them. The forest listened. Finally, June asked, "Why didn't you stop him?" Jacob's voice cracked. "Because I was 17, and afraid, and stupid, and because I thought she'd come back. That she always did." He looked down at his calloused palms. But some things don't unbreak. The night thickened. Jacob had stopped speaking, but the silence he left behind weighed heavier than words. No one dared move. Not June. Not Hannah. The flames in the fire pit had burned down to embers, casting a faint red glow like a wound that wouldn't close. Then came a crunch, soft but certain. Leaves. A footstep. Not Jacob's. From the woods beyond, a figure emerged. Slow, deliberate. Wrapped in a deerskin coat that trailed past the knees, moccasins laced in double spirals. His hair was silver black, braided down his spine like a rope to the past. Eowyn. He stepped into the light like someone who'd done this before, walked into the middle of other people's ghosts. His face was lined, carved deep by time and weather, but his eyes were unclouded. Jacob straightened. "Didn't expect you tonight." Ewan's voice was low and dry like stone against bark. "I heard the fire from the ridge, and I heard the stories ride again." He looked at Hannah, who stared back like she already knew him. Ewan gave a small nod, not greeting. Recognition. "You want to know what they told us," he said, settling onto a stump uninvited, but completely welcome. Who, June asked. "The men in town, the sheriffs, the preachers, the ones who buried it." Jacob stiffened. Ewan ignored him. "They said the girl ran off. Took her demon horse and disappeared into the wild. Said the mare was cursed. Said the wind stopped when it ran and birds wouldn't land where its shadow touched." He leaned forward, but they weren't afraid of the horse. Pause. They were afraid of the girl. Hannah didn't blink. Ewan's eyes didn't leave hers. She didn't ride like the boys. She didn't follow. She led. And that made them afraid. Because if one girl could ride like that, who else might stop asking for permission? He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded cloth. Inside it a small charm, woven reeds, a sliver of horsehair, a mourning braid. She was seen 2 days after they said she vanished. "My uncle found this near the circle." June's breath caught. The stone circle. Ewan nodded. "That place has always had its own rules. You bury truth there, it rises." Jacob stood slowly. "What are you saying?" Ewan looked up at him. "I'm saying she never left. I'm saying they didn't chase her away. They stopped her. And when it was done, they buried her in the only place they couldn't hear her anymore." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wet leaves and something metallic beneath it. Earth turned, waiting. June rose first. She walked to the edge of the clearing past the dying fire, the light no longer enough to hold back the dark. Her boots sank softly into moss, but she didn't stop. Her gaze was fixed on a direction only memory could name. Hannah followed, then Jacob, then Ewan last, walking slow like someone escorting more than the living. They reached the circle just before midnight. The stones glowed faint under the moonlight. The air was unnaturally still. No birds, no rustling leaves, just breath. And something older. Ewan stepped inside first. This place, he said, was once where we sent our dead. Not just bodies. Grief, guilt, horses who carried burdens not theirs to bear. He walked to the far edge of the circle, where the stones thinned out into a soft slope of ferns. He turned. "Here." Jacob frowned. "Here what?" "This is where they put her." June knelt. "You're sure?" Ewan's voice didn't change. "My uncle saw them carry something at dawn. A man and a boy. A shape wrapped in oilskin. Hooves hanging out." Jacob's knees buckled slightly. June whispered Harold and David Carson. Jacob shook his head. No, David was a kid. He would have done what he was told," Ewan said flatly. "Like you. Like all of us." Silence cracked. Hannah stood at the spot Ewan had marked. She didn't cry, didn't speak. She just looked down and slowly, almost reverently, took the comb from her coat pocket and placed it on the ground. Then she began to dig. June knelt beside her. not to stop her, to help. Her fingers sank into damp soil. Pine roots, cold stones, rotting leaves. Jacob followed, breathing hard, his nails tearing on bark and clay. Ewan watched and waited. They didn't have to dig far. Barely a foot down, June's fingers struck wood. Not new, not polished, rough-hewn, crude. A crate, but the wood was blackened, burnt along the edges, like it had once caught flame, then been buried to extinguish it. June scraped back more earth. Her hand froze. She saw it. Hair, pale silvered by time, braided and curled in a final loop. No bones, no clothes, just a lock of hair, bound in red string. And beneath it, pressed into the edge of the crate, the other half of the comb. Hannah reached in. Her fingers didn't shake. She brought both halves together. They fit, perfectly, even after 6 decades underground. The circle stirred. A gust of wind spiraled inward, brushing the hair from June's face. The candles she'd left days ago, at the last vigil, flickered back to life, unlit, untouched, and then extinguished in unison. Jacob fell to his knees. "I should have told someone," he said hoarsely. "I should have gone after her. I should have—" "No," June said softly. She looked at Hannah. She came back for her voice, and she found it. Ewan crouched beside them. His hand hovered over the crate, not touching but near. "Do you feel it?" he asked. Hannah nodded. June too. Jacob simply wept. In that moment, none of them saw Maple step into the circle. She moved soundlessly. Her chestnut coat shimmered under moonlight. She walked straight to the place where the crate had been uncovered, and knelt, just as Violet had 60 years ago. Not because she was told, but because she knew. They stayed there until dawn. The crate was not reburied. It didn't need to be. They built a cairn, small solemn of stones from the circle one by one, each hand placing a memory, a reckoning, a silent apology. At the top, the comb, whole again. No one in town ever spoke of Lillian Carson again. Not officially. No plaques, no records, no justice. But at the edge of those woods near a circle too old for maps, people began to leave things. A hairbrush, a braid of rope, a child's drawing of a woman on horseback, and always, always the sound of hooves in the morning fog. The forest didn't call her this time. She chose to return. The sun had not yet risen, but the sky had turned silver with its promise. Hannah stood beside Maple, one hand resting against the mare's flank. No saddle, no bridle, no command. She didn't need them. Maple dipped her head, accepting her weight, as Hannah swung onto her back, like breath silent and sure. No one followed her. Not June, not her parents, not even the wind. She didn't tell them where she was going. They already knew. The forest parted. No brambles reached for her this time. No roots tripped her. The trail, though invisible, opened before them, like it remembered the sound of Violet's hooves. Maple moved with purpose, ears forward, body loose, breath steady. They rode not as two, but as memory, living and relived. The circle waited. The mist clung low to the earth like reverence. The stones were damp with dewlight, tracing the moss like veins. It didn't feel like a place of death anymore. It felt listening. Maple stopped at the edge without prompting. Hannah slid down. No fear, just stillness. She opened her pack. The sketchbook came first. Worn now, the corners bent, but sacred. She flipped to the page, the one of Lillian on horseback, half-turned eyes wide, mouth open, as if calling to something behind her. She placed it in the center of the circle, then the comb whole once again. It glowed faintly in her palm, as if holding warmth from some inner hearth. She set it beside the sketch. Then, with a small piece of charcoal, she wrote in slow, careful letters on the flat stone at the center. "I hear you." She didn't sign her name. She didn't need to. She stood back from the stone, her breath visible in the morning cold. The silence wasn't empty. It pulsed. The trees leaned in branches curled like hands above an altar. Hannah raised her arms, not as a plea, not as surrender, as release. For a long moment, nothing moved. Even Maple stood still, as if caught between hoofbeats. Then the light changed. It didn't come from the sky, but from the air itself. A golden shimmer bloomed from behind the trees, soft as the edge of a dream. Shafts of brightness filtered between the trunks, fanning across the circle in slow motion, as if the forest had drawn its breath and was now exhaling the truth. The comb began to glow. Not bright, but hot. It hissed a faint sound, at first like embers waking. Smoke curled up from its edges. Hannah didn't move. She watched. The sketchbook flipped open on its own. Pages turned in a breeze no one could feel. 1, 2, 3. Then it stopped. A blank page. The charcoal lifted by nothing, by air, by memory, and began to move. A hand without flesh, a gesture without muscle. Line by line, stroke by stroke. And from the invisible began to emerge the face of a woman. Lillian, but not as she was in pain. Not as a victim. This was Lillian in freedom. Hair flowing, back straight, eyes fierce, not haunted. Alive. Seen. Maple reared once high and clean hooves slicing the air. She didn't panic. She cried out. A long, rising trumpet that cracked the air like truth too long buried. Hannah didn't flinch. She raised her face to the light, her arms still wide. And then it came. The heat. Not physical, but bone deep. A warmth that swept through the circle, through her chest, her hands, her throat. She gasped, not in fear, in remembrance. A wind swirled once then, once more. Faster now. It lifted her braid from her back. It tugged at the edges of the drawing, and when it passed, she felt it, not a voice in her ear, a breath against her cheek. Thank you. The comb cracked, once, then twice. Its surface blackened, curled, and then, as if it had finished its purpose, it turned to ash. Not scattered, just fell into itself. Gone. The ashes didn't scatter. They settled in a perfect crescent around the edge of the sketch. A smudge of black against white, like a final signature. Hannah knelt beside it. She touched her fingers to the soot, warm, gentle, and she drew a single silent line beneath the face of Lillian, no longer screaming, no longer afraid. Just looking forward, just looking free. When she turned back to Maple, the mare was breathing hard. Eyes wide, but calm, like something had passed through her. Not pain, not terror. Peace. Maple stepped forward into the center of the circle and lowered her head, as if to bow, to honor, or to say goodbye. Hannah didn't cry. She didn't need to. There was nothing to mourn, only something to carry forward. By the time she returned to camp, the sun had finally risen. June saw her first standing tall. Her braid windswept charcoal on her fingers, something different in her eyes. Not innocence lost, but a deeper knowing, a kind of quiet power no one could take. Her parents ran to her arms out, voices overlapping in panic and relief. But Hannah just smiled and handed her mother the sketchbook. Open to the last page, she said. The drawing took their breath. It was her, yes, Lillian, but not alone. Behind her, like a shadow, and a sister, stood Hannah herself. Same eyes, same wind in their hair, same tilt of the jaw. And in the space between them, hovering in midair, lit by an unseen glow, the comb, whole, alive, not real. But there, that's not what you drew before, her father whispered. No, Hannah said. It's what she gave me to remember. That night, no one lit the fire. They sat in silence under the stars. The forest was still, but not silent. From deep in the woods, a faint sound echoed. Not quite wind, not quite hoofbeats, but somewhere in between. A rhythm older than memory, a breath older than blood. In the months that followed, Hannah never drew Lillian again. She didn't need to. But the comb began to appear hidden in corners of her sketches, woven into clouds, etched into bark, reflected in windows. It was never the same shape twice, but it was always there, always whole. No wind moved through the trees, but everything had changed. You could feel it in the way the forest breathed. Not cautiously like before, but deeply. Like it had slept too long and now stretched in sunlight. Maple stood near the edge of the circle, her chestnut coat catching the dawn light in silent gold. She was different, still, present, not watching for something lost, but aware of something returned. Back at the house, Hannah stood before a fresh sheet of paper. She hadn't touched her sketchbook in 3 days, not since the circle. Not since the ashes. Not since Lillian's voice had finally left her chest. But her fingers didn't shake now. Her grip was firm, her shoulders steady. She lifted the charcoal, closed her eyes, and began to draw. It wasn't Lillian. It wasn't Maple. It wasn't the comb or the circle or the cairn of stones that still sat like a heartbeat in the woods. It was space, air, room. The sketch filled with the curves, weightless structures, light falling through invisible windows, movement and stillness. A woman on the edge of something vast, no horse, no flame, just breath and motion, undefined. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew it was true. When June entered the room, she didn't ask what Hannah was drawing. She just stood behind her and smiled. "She's with you," Hannah nodded, but her answer wasn't words. It was the line she pressed gently into the edge of the page, curling like a strand of hair. The town didn't want a monument, not at first. They didn't mind the story whispered behind closed doors. Didn't protest the hush in the cafes when someone mentioned the name Lillian. But a monument, a sign carved in stone, a marker that said, "We let this happen," that was harder. That was public. That was truth. But June didn't ask for permission. She filed the permit. She sent a letter to the local paper. "We cannot bury what we refuse to name." She walked into the city office with the comb sketch in her hand and the locket around her neck. She spoke plainly with decades behind her voice, and something shifted. 1 week later, the town council approved the plaque. They built it not far from the edge of the circle, just beyond where the moss grows thick and the trees part like old hands. The stone was gray Vermont granite, clean, unassuming, unapologetic. It read, "In memory of Lillian Carson and her mare Violet." She did not run. She rode. She did not vanish. She was buried. She was not forgotten. She was erased. To all who are told to sit down and stay quiet, may you ride anyway. Beside it, they planted a single cedar tree, young, straight, resilient. Its roots reached into earth that had once held silence. Now it held memory. Hannah placed the first offering at the base. A sketch, not of Lillian this time, but of the forest itself, open, breathing, unfinished. At the edge of the page, a silhouette on horseback head turned riding not away, but through. When the plaque was unveiled, 23 people came, more than they expected. Some were strangers, Some were elders. One was a girl from the high school holding a notebook. She wore boots too big for her and a stare too sharp for 17. She asked June if she could interview her. June said, "Only if you record every damn word." The podcast didn't start big. Just a USB mic, a worn notebook, and June's voice low, raspy, deliberate. She called it Unearthed. Episode 1, The Girl with the Comb. She didn't dramatize, didn't dress it up with music or effects. She read the story as it was, as it happened. No frills, no soft edges. She was 16 when they told her to be quiet. 17 when she bled on barn floorboards. They said she was a girl who rode like a man. They said the horse was the sin, but it was her freedom they feared. She talked about the circle, the silence, the way Lillian's name vanished from records by 72. She named the men who buried her. She said their names, slowly, and then said, "We cannot change what they did. But we can decide whether we're going to keep helping them do it." It went viral in a week, by accident. Someone clipped a quote. She didn't break the rules. She broke their idea of her and put it over a photo of the memorial stone. Within days, schools in 2 other states added the episode to a women's history curriculum. A gallery in Maine asked to exhibit Hannah's drawings. One by one, messages came in. My grandmother had a sister like her. This reminded me why I left home. I thought I was the only one who heard hooves in the quiet. Hannah listened once, just once. Then she closed the app and went outside to draw, because it wasn't about listening anymore. It was about continuing. Maple stood beside her, grazing softly, ears flicking only when the wind changed. Sometimes Hannah would stop and run her hand along the mare's neck. Still strong, still present, but no longer carrying the echo of someone else. Maple was hers now, and free. That fall, a new child came to the school in town. Quiet, eyes like storm clouds. She didn't speak for the first 3 weeks, until one day the teacher found her sketching in the back of the classroom, a girl on horseback. No face, but in her mane, a single carved word. Lillian. The forest is quiet, but not empty. The light has changed, softer now, more forgiving. Autumn has begun its slow return, the leaves crisp at the edges, the air laced with the scent of cedar and ash. A new pair of feet crunches softly across the forest floor. They're small, bare. A child steps into the circle. We've never seen her before. She doesn't speak, doesn't shout, just walks steady as if led by something older than instinct. She kneels beside the moss-covered stone, brushing away fallen leaves. They're nestled in the hollow between roots and memory. A shard, just a sliver of blackened wood. Charred, worn, still warm. She picks it up. It fits between her fingers like it's always belonged there. The moment her skin touches it, a sound stirs. Not outside, inside. A horse's whinny, low, gentle, distant, like a memory echoing through bone. The child freezes, then smiles. Not wide, just enough. Behind her, the forest exhales. The trees lean back. The moss softens. The circle remembers. We pull back, up through the canopy, above the trees. The whole forest beneath us alive, no longer haunted. And as we rise, one last sound follows us. A second whinny. Stronger now. Freer. Not sorrow. Not loss. But the beginning of something returned. Fade to black. Then a single line in silence. Legacy does not die. It waits to be heard. This is not an ending. It's a continuation. The missing are not lost. The silenced are not broken. They are stories waiting in the roots, in the soil, in the smoke. Waiting for hands, small enough, brave enough to listen.